All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming tonight to hear about and to discuss the reasons for poverty in America and ideas how to increase wealth, incomes, and opportunities for Americans. I'm Henrik Schatzinger and co-director of the Center for Politics and the People, along with my colleague, Dr. Brian Smith. As I mentioned yesterday, but of course I always encourage people to follow us on social media. We have sort of interesting discussions, and sometimes we have new events that are not even announced yet. I can already mention, for example, we will have one event coming up on October 3rd about what is the best immigration policy with Dr. Jennifer Hunt from Rutgers University. That'll be October 3rd, 4:30. Not here, but this will be in Bayer Auditorium. But you will get an email, or again, the easiest way to check out about new coming events is to look at social media on Facebook and Twitter. Just like yesterday's event and last week's event, this is also another event where individuals approached us and made suggestions on what kind of event we could maybe organize. And so in this case, we have Chris Schaefer, alum of 2010. Chris was also a student of mine, just sort of when I started out here at Ripon College, was an excellent student, and he's a very involved alum, has accomplished many things, and he is currently the policy director for Representative Rob Brooks in the Wisconsin State Assembly. And now I will turn it over to Chris, who will introduce our speaker, Michael Tanner, because they have a personal connection that they made, I think, in 2009.
Thank you, Henrik. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Yes, as Henrik said, I had the opportunity to interview Mr. Tanner for my American University capstone thesis on Social Security back in 2008. And I've been a big admirer of his work ever since. And so when his new book came out, I suggested to Henrik that the Center for People and Politics should consider bringing him to Ripon College. So Mr. Tanner currently serves as senior fellow at the Cato Institute, where he heads research in a variety of domestic policies, with an emphasis on poverty and social welfare policy, healthcare, Social Security, and entitlement reform. His most recent book, which I have here, if you haven't seen it yet, The Inclusive Economy, I consider a must-read for anyone who's interested in social welfare policy, as it explores the ways government contributes to poverty in the U.S. and suggests reforms that will enable the poor to more fully participate in the growing economy. Michael Tanner is the author of 5 other books, including A New Deal for Social Security and Leviathan on the Right, How Big Government Conservatism Brought Down the Republican Party. His writings have appeared in every major newspaper, including the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and Los Angeles Times. In addition, he writes a weekly column for National Review as a contributing columnist with the New York Post. The New York Times has referred to him as one of the most lucid writers, or a lucid writer and a skilled polemicist, and Congressional Quarterly named him one of the nation's 5 most influential experts on Social Security. This evening, he'll discuss ideas from his latest book, and in it he addresses 5 critical areas: criminal justice reform, education, housing, savings, and financial inclusion, and regressive regulations that prevent low-income Americans from being able to participate in the nation's economic growth. Please join me in welcoming to Ripon College, Michael Tanner.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. Thank you particularly for making me feel old. 2009. Oh well. But I want to thank you all for having me here. I really do, and thank you for it not being in February. That's much appreciated. It's beautiful here, and I do appreciate the opportunity. I've been to Wisconsin many times, always love it. It's real opportunities to see this area. Now, I wouldn't necessarily let that go to your head, because I both live and work inside the DC Beltway, so I'm always thrilled to be somewhere else. I want to talk to you today about poverty, if I can, both the causes and hopefully some of the cures for it. And we should all care about it. We should care about it, if for no other reason than the fact that we're moral human beings, and we should not want anybody left behind. And we should care about it as well because we are taxpayers and citizens of this country. We actually spend a great deal of money fighting poverty in this country. The federal government actually operates and funds more than $100 different anti-poverty programs. About 72 of those programs provide benefits to individuals, and the remainder provide benefits to low-income communities, things like the Community Development Block Grant and so on that goes to areas of high poverty. And for all this money, we actually have reduced poverty. We spend to fund those programs about $700 billion at the federal level, and another $300 billion at the state and local level. If you want to go back to 1965 when Lyndon Johnson declared war on poverty, we've spent about $28 trillion on these poverty programs since that time. And as I say, we have reduced poverty as a result of that. The poverty rate is lower because we have those programs than it would be in the absence of those programs. I think a lot of people sort of say that it's accomplished nothing, but it has reduced poverty rates. I mean, look at it. Even something as inefficient as the federal government can't spend $28 trillion without accomplishing something, right? I mean, if you flew over this country with an airplane and dumped $1 trillion a year out of the back of that airplane, you'd reduce poverty. So I don't know how proud we should be of that, but we have done that. But the question is whether or not simply reducing poverty or making poverty a little bit less miserable, if you will, should be the goal. Is that sufficient? It's probably necessary, but is it sufficient to simply reduce the misery of poverty, or should we be trying for something more? If you all can remember back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which you've covered in political science classes or psychology classes and so on, at the very bottom of that need are the basic necessities of life. And we do a pretty good job of providing them. Very few people in America are actually starving to death anymore. We are not the South Sudan by any stretch of the imagination. Most people have the basic necessities of life, and that's where our programs tend to direct them. But if you move up towards the top of that pyramid, towards the idea of people becoming fully actualized human beings, we don't do such a good job. And that should actually be the goal, not just of poverty policy, but all public policy should be human flourishing. We should enable people to flourish. That everyone should be able to become everything that their individual talents enable them to be. That people should be able to be self-sufficient, to take care of themselves and their families. That people should be able to rise as far as their talents will go. That people should have opportunities to become everything that they can be. And in those regards, we don't do a very good job with our anti-poverty policies. So I set out when writing this book to try to see if there was a better way to approach what we're doing in terms of fighting poverty. Can we basically do those things at the bottom that are dealing with the necessities of life while also doing more to empower people to rise up that pyramid? And one of the things I found, I said, let's strip this down. Let's go right back to the very beginning of the question, and let's ask a very simple question. And we just lost our PowerPoint. Whoops. Nothing like technology. At any rate, I asked a basic question, which is, why are people poor? I mean, if you were a doctor, you wouldn't try to treat someone's illness without understanding what it was that actually made them sick. You wouldn't say, oh, here's a bunch of pills, who cares what your underlying disease is? You'd actually want to know what it is that they're suffering from. The same reason if we go into public policy, we shouldn't try to figure out how to cure poverty or how to end poverty or fight poverty without knowing what causes poverty. And one of the things that I found when I started looking into this was that there were two different theories of why people are poor. And that if you actually find out that both politically, they both have they sort of a political side to them and an academic side to them. And the two sides really disagree. They actually get quite nasty with each other. Both the political sides of this debate and the academic sides of this debate really are uncomfortable with each other. And these two theories, one is might be called the individual behavior theory of poverty, or the culture of poverty theory. I'm sure you've all heard people talk about the culture of poverty. That's sort of one theory behind this. The other is structural poverty, the idea that there's a structural cause of poverty. So I want to take a brief look at both of these theories and see how they add up, if you will, what's behind them. The first, the individual behavior or cultural poverty theory, basically says that the poor are responsible in some ways for their own poverty because they make bad choices and bad decisions in their life. And it's those choices and decisions that they make that ultimately lead them to be poor. And therefore, we need to worry about the incentive structure that we create. We need to worry about educating the poor to make better decisions. We need to change their behavior, change their culture, and that will ultimately lead people out of poverty. And the people who argue for this theory generally rely on something called the success sequence. And the success sequence says that if you finish school, at least high school, graduate high school, and then you get a job, and then you get married before you have children, you are unlikely to be poor. And I can tell you statistically that is absolutely true. Very few people who do all three of those things are going to be living in poverty, and especially not for any length of time. Very few. And in fact, even individually, each of these things break down so that you're not likely to be poor if you follow them, if you don't follow them, you're much more likely to be poor. For example, about half of all high school dropouts will be poor. Almost nobody who finishes college will be poor for any length of time. About 3% of people who work are actually living below the poverty line. If you work full-time, only about 3% of people who do that live below the poverty line. Even part-time work, only about 15% of people who work part-time live below the poverty line. But if you're unemployed, the numbers shoot up to about 50%. And if you have children outside of marriage, you are 5 times more likely to be poor than if you wait until after you're married before you have kids, or if you don't have kids at all. So you can certainly see where the strength of this argument comes from. Now, there are a couple of issues there. There's certainly a chicken and egg question. You know, do people who make the bad choices here make those choices and that pushes them into poverty, or the things that make them poor make them more likely to make the bad choices? You also can argue that, you know, I showed correlation on these sort of things, but causation and correlation are two different things, as any political scientist or statistician will tell you at great length. The other theory is the theory of structural poverty. And this is the idea that it's not the behavior or the choices of poor people themselves that lead to poverty, but forces outside of their control. And in particular, people will argue about race, gender, and economic issues being responsible for why people fall into poverty. And again, there's an argument behind each of these. If you can look at them as a whole, or you can look at them individually. We know race, for example, that slavery alone stole about $10 trillion in capital out of the African American community that's not available to them today. We know that Jim Crow era depressed wages for African Americans and job opportunities and educational opportunities for African Americans, which has deprived them of being able to pass down inheritance that leaves their children poorer today. We know that the system today still in many ways is racist and mistreats African Americans, from the criminal justice system to the education system to housing to hiring and so on, all of which can leave people into poverty. We know on gender issues that the playing field is not level, that we acculturate women to have children rather than to earn higher wages. We know that men still don't do equal shares around the household, so that women have to do both their job, earning money, and then come home and take care of the house or raise the kids in addition to that. We know that there's not necessarily value placed on women's work the same way. All of these sorts of things can lead women to poverty. And then economic issues, economic dislocation. We need to recognize that creative destruction, in Schumpeter's term, which is something I love, and which leaves us all better off, it leaves somebody behind sometimes. You know, as an economist, in many lectures I've talked about the fact that we're all better off because buggy whip manufacturers went out of business when we invented the automobile. Nobody wants to go back and say, you know, we need to save those jobs of those buggy whip manufacturers, you know, so let's get rid of cars and we'll all go back to the buggies. But if you were a buggy whip manufacturer, maybe the best buggy whip manufacturer in the country, you don't have a job anymore. You're now left out. And maybe you can't be retrained to make cars because you've been making buggy whips and you're 62 years old. What are you going to do? You know, the day we perfect the self-driving car, roughly 4 million jobs go away. Think about it. No more truck drivers, right? Taxis and Uber drivers go away. Delivery vehicles, none of them are necessary. And the people who did that for a living, out of luck. Now, as a society, we're going to be better off. We're all going to be richer. It's going to create more wealth. It's going to make things easier. Things are going to get to us faster. We're going to be better off as a country and as a society. But some individuals are not going to be as good off. And that can push them into poverty even though they didn't make any bad decisions. So, who's correct? I think the reality is that both of them are correct, and neither one's correct in some ways. I mean, look, you can't pretend that the poor are simply chaff blown on the winds of fate. They have no choices, no control over their own lives. Nothing they do matters at all. It's all from outside. I mean, that's a pretty demeaning way to look at people with low incomes, isn't it? To treat them like nothing they do matters. On the other hand, look, it's a fact of life that all of our choices are made within certain constraints. And if you're poor, or a woman, or a person of color, you face very different constraints than if you're a rich white kid. You know, if you grow up in a community where there's no jobs, where the school system sucks, where every time you set foot outside your door you're hassled by the police, you're going to end up making very different choices and decisions than if you grow up in a suburban area where things are much different. Right? So, you know, both sides of that argument have something to say for them. But I think they're also missing two big points. And the first is that whatever side of that debate you come down on, what we're doing now isn't working. It isn't fixing it. It doesn't matter whether you believe the poor are making bad choices, we're not fixing those choices. Or whether society is responsible, we're not fixing society. Whatever it is, we're not making it any better. And the second big part of this is I think it misses a third villain in this. I think that it's not the poor responsible for their poverty, and it's not society responsible for poverty. It is the government responsible for poverty. This is from a poll we did of poor people. We went out and we actually did a survey. We hired YouGov, which is the same pollster that the New York Times uses. And we asked poor people whether or not they thought the war on poverty had been effective. This is kind of interesting. Republicans were more likely than Democrats to think that the war on poverty had failed. But both sides didn't like it. But look at people who are poor, people who are on welfare today, who are dependent on that war on poverty for their livelihood today. 63% said that they didn't think the war on poverty worked. So even people who are suffering, or people who are poor and dependent on welfare, don't think welfare does a particularly good job. Okay, we said, well, okay, maybe it's they just think we don't spend enough. Maybe they think the war on poverty failed because their welfare check is too low. Maybe if we spent more, it would work, right? So we actually asked them that. We said, suppose money was no issue. Suppose we could spend an unlimited amount of money. There was no limit to how much we could spend fighting poverty. Do you think the government could fix it? And 58% of welfare recipients said no. They said even if the government could spend as much as it wanted fighting poverty, it doesn't know how to fix poverty. And similar numbers, even better numbers among Democrats as a whole and Republicans as a whole. Americans just don't believe government is capable of understanding how to fight poverty. So I think this is a better approach. I think we should do something different. And here's something really radical. Instead of worrying just about how we're going to lift people out of poverty, what program we can create, whether we should spend a little dollar more. You know, the typical debate in Washington is we spend $98 billion a year on food stamps. So one kind comes in and says, we're the compassionate side. We think it should be $99 billion. And the other side comes in and says, oh no, we're the fiscally responsible side. We want to cut it to $97 billion. Like either one of those is going to make any difference, right? Here's a really radical idea. Let's stop making people poor in the first place. Let's go back to that thing that I said earlier, that it's not the people, not the poor themselves that are causing poverty or society at large. It is the government that is doing things right now that is actually making people poor. And I identified in my book a number of areas that I think the government should begin to work on in terms of making reforms. That we can do things that actually will stop poverty and make it easier for people who are poor now to get out. Number one on this list is criminal justice reform. Look, we know that the criminal justice system is not fair to everybody. It's not a level playing field. And we also know that it makes people much harder for some people to get out of poverty. The United States incarcerates more people than any other country in the world, with the exception of the Seychelles Islands. And it's not even close. You know, we make so many things in this country illegal that shouldn't be illegal in the first place. And I'm talking about, of course, you know, there's the war on drugs. There's the war on sex work, which is just the war on drugs applied to women. I mean, my God, let's remember that Eric Garner in New York was killed for the crime of selling an untaxed cigarette. And once we deal with the fact that we make things far too illegal, we also have to look at every other aspect of the criminal justice system, from the way the police interact with people on the street, to how we sentence people, to how we deal with plea bargaining, to how we treat people once they're in prison, to the fact that far too many people have a criminal record that'll prevent them from getting a job and supporting a family. This has a big impact on poverty. I'll just give you one example. Conservatives, remember if you go back to that success sequence, conservatives worry a lot about women who have children outside of marriage. And as I said, you're 5 times more likely to be poor if you are. So conservatives come up with a lot of different ways to try to incentivize marriage or discourage out of marriage childbearing and so on. George Bush once wanted to have a pro-marriage program. He was actually going to put up billboards in poor areas saying marriage is good. Well, I have a question for people who want, you know, women in the inner city to get married before they have kids. Who are they supposed to marry? I mean, it's not like there's this giant pool of inner city computer programmers that are waiting around for them. William Julius Wilson from Harvard points out that we have taken 1.5 million young black men out of the marriage pool because they're in the criminal justice system. That they're in jail, on probation, or they have a criminal record that makes it difficult, if not impossible, for them to get a job that's going to enable them to support a family. Scholars at Vanderbilt University estimate that if we were to be able to enact criminal justice reform, we could reduce the poverty rate by 20% through that alone. Just give you one example here. We actually asked, again, talking before, we actually asked, has a criminal record ever been a barrier to your finding a job? And what you find is that 23% of welfare recipients, almost a quarter, said that they had trouble getting a job because they had a criminal record. I mean, just think, you got picked up for pot when you were 18 or 19 years old. Now you're in your 30s and you're going out looking for a job and you have to say, oh yeah, I got a felony conviction on my record. How fast are you going to be called in for that interview, right? Or landlords can ask it. You might not be able to get into a house. Schools, colleges ask it. You might not be able to get that scholarship. You might not even get admitted. It can follow you around your whole life because you made a mistake when you were young. Now that's fine. We certainly want records to follow around people who are murderers and rapists and so on. But do we really care, for some of these other crimes? If somebody sold an untaxed cigarette, do we really want that following them around for their whole life? Second area that we can reform, our education system. Kind of common sense that getting a good education is one of the roots out of poverty, right? And yet we know that far too many schools, particularly in poor communities and communities of color, don't do a very good job of educating people. And this is not simply a question of money. This chart here, this black line up the top here, that is actually spending on education, adjusted for inflation. You can see we spend more money all the time on education. The second line down is also going up. That's school employees. We're hiring more teachers, more ancillary employees as well in the school. Far too many administration people, but we're hiring more. These bottom lines, that's test scores. That's results. Now, I'm not a big fan of tests, but you certainly see that we're not getting a whole lot of bang for more bucks here. Simply spending more money on education isn't necessarily buying us anything. Look, I think part of the problem is that we simply don't have as much innovation as we need in the school system. We basically have the same education system that we had 300 years ago. I mean, back then, you had a one-room schoolhouse with a blackboard, but essentially, if you're talking about the pedagogy, it's the same. Today we have a computer and multiple classrooms or whatever. It's the computer screen up there, but you're still teaching roughly the same way. We don't have a whole lot of new innovation. And the reason we don't have that type of innovation is essentially monopolies don't do a great job of improving customer service. And our government school system is essentially a monopoly that exists largely to benefit the administrators and the teachers, not to benefit students and parents. We need a lot more competition. We need a lot more innovation. We need a lot more entrepreneurship in education. And we need the control over education spending to lie with parents and their kids, who are ultimately the customers of this education system. Housing. This one really surprised me. When I started out for this, I didn't realize how big an issue housing was going to be, but it's a huge issue for the poor. Do you realize the average poor person spends about 40% of their income on housing, on rent? That's a big hit if you don't have a lot of money. If you're low income and you're spending 40% of that to put a roof over your head, that's a big hit. But beyond that, the high cost of housing also ghettoizes the poor. It forces them into certain areas with high concentrations of poverty and prevents them from moving to areas that might have more jobs, or might have better schools, or might have lower crime rates. They're basically stuck where they are and unable to move because the rents in these other places are so high. And that's one thing if that was simply a result of market forces, but far too often that is actually the result of government policies, zoning policies, land use policies, and so on that actually drive up the cost of rent. We know that in some communities, for example, in San Francisco and Manhattan, the zoning laws alone add 50% to the cost of housing, the cost of rent in that area. California, 25% of all, or 23% of all the poor people in the country reside in California. And yet, the state makes it almost impossible to build multifamily housing. 75%, as much as 75% of all of the land that is zoned residential in California is zoned for single-family only housing. So, you have a supply and demand problem. This is basic economics. You have a big demand for housing, you're limiting the supply, and then surprise when prices go up. So, basically, we have to, we have to look at ways to bring down the cost of housing. We actually asked, again, whether people found it difficult to move because the cost of rents. And we found that that essentially people who had the higher your income, the more likely you're able to move. Even actually people earning $100,000 a year, about 52% of them said that they had been prevented from moving where they wanted to move because the cost of moving, cost of living was too high, cost of rent or housing was too high. But among welfare recipients, 78% of welfare recipients said that it had gotten in the way of them trying to move to a better area where they might be able to do a better job of raising their kids. That were essentially trapping them out there. So again, we should be looking at those type of regulations. Fourth, we should be making savings easier. Again, another common sense solution here. You don't get out of poverty by spending money. You can't spend your way out of debt. You can't spend your way out of poverty. You want people to save money. And yet our policies are too often kind of perversely designed to encourage people to spend and not to save. We make it difficult for poor people to simply open a bank account. Now, because we're so terrified of the war on terror and the war on drugs and all these sort of things, we require all sorts of identification to simply open a savings account. People worry about voting and voting IDs and all this sort of thing. But you have to have identification to open a bank account. 20% of poor people don't have sufficient identification in order to be able to open a bank account. And think what it means if you don't have one, right? It means that when you get a check, you got to go down to one of the local check cashing places and pay 18% or something like that in order to cash your check. Then you have to carry around a wad of cash in your pocket, so you either get robbed or the police think you're a drug courier and seize the money. It hardly seems like that's encouraging people to save. And then you look at the welfare programs we have, they have asset limits. Now, obviously, you don't want the local lottery winner to, collecting welfare. But, we tell people basically, if you're on welfare, you get your check and you spend every penny of it. Hey, there's some new running shoes down at the store there. Go get them new basketball shoes. You go down and spend your check on that. We're cool. That's fine. Put any of that money in a 529 account so your kids can go to school someday. We're going to take away your check. You have a car, so you might be able to go look for a job. We're going to take away your check. Inherit a house, even if it's underwater or whatever, we're going to take away your check. Seems to have it completely backward, doesn't it? I mean, shouldn't the incentive be to earn more money and save more money, not to penalize people? We do the same, with welfare in terms of earnings as well. As an economist and someone in Washington, we debate all the time about marginal tax rates. But the highest marginal tax rate in the world isn't for a millionaire or a billionaire. The highest marginal tax rate there is for somebody who leaves welfare and takes a job. You start paying taxes on the first dollar you earn, and you start losing your benefits the moment you start earning money on your own. And of course, you also incur the cost of going to work. Now you've got to have child care and transportation and clothing and all that sort of thing. You can actually end up worse off financially if you take a job than if you remain on welfare. Seems to me you got the incentives all wrong in trying to do that. And then finally, is what I call inclusive economic growth. We know that nothing has lifted more people out of poverty than economic growth. For people who believe in redistribution, you can't redistribute something that doesn't exist. If you don't create wealth, you're not going to be able to redistribute it. And for people who don't believe in the large-scale redistribution, and I'm one of those, people can't grow their way, get out of poverty unless there's a growing economy to provide them with jobs and opportunities. This is known as the great fact. This is, throughout most of man's history, mankind was desperately, miserably poor. And they were ruled over by a tiny elite that was slightly less desperately, miserably poor. Even go back 100 years ago, I mean, how many of us, even people who are poor, would trade your life for the life of, say, Vanderbilt or Carnegie 100 years ago? Yeah, they had big houses. They weren't heated. Trouble getting to them because, the only way they could get transport was on that buggy with that, magnificent buggy whip we talked about earlier. Their life expectancy, about 40% of women died in childbirth. There was massive flu epidemics, typhus epidemics, and swept through. Imagine, if you got sick, you went to the doctor, good luck. Does that really, what's changed? Well, what happened was that about 300 years ago, along came modern, entrepreneurial, free market capitalism. And wealth began to increase dramatically, and it has continued to increase, and even over what was 100 years ago, it's increased dramatically, and we're all enormously better off as a result of it. But, no, in fact, we actually, let me just go back here. We went back to the poor people, and we asked them, which would be better for you? Which is more important? More economic growth or more welfare spending? Well, 76% of welfare recipients said that economic growth was more important than increased welfare spending. People who are depending on their check thought it was more important that we have economic growth as a society than that they get a bigger check. They recognized that the way out of poverty, what they wanted to do was that to be able to achieve and to rise up was going to take economic growth. So economic growth is important. We know what brings economic growth is economic freedom. This is a chart done by the Fraser Institute every year. It's part of it's put together actually by a consortium of a couple of hundred think tanks from around the world that looks at economic freedom and compares that to GDP per capita. And what you find is it's pretty unambiguous that the more freedom you have in your society, the more you grow. We know that economic freedom, lower taxes, less regulation, and all of that leads to more economic growth. But here's the big but. Here's where a lot of conservatives focus on that first part. They'll say, okay, cut taxes, cut regulation, good enough. We're going to get economic growth. But that isn't enough. Because if all that economic growth only accrues to the people at the top, that's not going to do anything to reduce poverty. It's not going to help those people at the bottom. What you got to do is look at what barriers there are that prevent poor people from participating in that economic growth. They have to be part of that economic growth. They have to gain from that economic growth just like everyone else. So we need to look at what are the barriers to their being part of that. And it turns out there's a number of barriers to that. Some of them are as simple as things like occupational licensing. Between 25 and 30% of all the jobs in this country require you to get permission from the government to practice your profession. Often at great cost, often in terms of time it's a significant barrier. Let me give you just one example. In the state of Louisiana, you're a single mother. You want to get off of welfare. You want to get a job, support yourself. Turns out you're pretty good at arranging flowers. Your friends and neighbors, they all like, say you've got this natural sense of this. So you want to become a florist. Turns out you have to get a license to become a florist in Louisiana. 8-month course. You have to get the books. You have to pay for the course. You're going to have to go out twice a night, which means you're going to have to get a babysitter to watch your kid while you're going to that class twice a week for 8 months. Then you're going to have to take a test to show you're a good florist, because God forbid bad floral arrangements, we could all be doomed. So you have to take that test, which is only given twice a year.
and only in Monroe, Louisiana. And it's a 2-day test. So you have to find transportation to Monroe, and a hotel, and child care, and pay for the test before you can become a florist. And I'm not talking, and this isn't about doctors or lawyers. This is about florists and barbers and hairdressers, funeral attendants, interior decorators. 25 to 30% of all jobs in America. In Ohio, they actually have a program in the prisons to teach prisoners to become barbers. Spend a couple $1 million a year on it. Seems like a pretty good idea. It's a moderately low-skilled job, something that prisoners can learn and get out, prepare themselves, to be able to take care of themselves when they get out of prison. Except for the fact that in Ohio you can't get a barber's license if you have a criminal record, which is sort of evidence of your government at work. Why are we stopping people from getting jobs that they otherwise could do? We asked poor people, we said, has the lack of an occupational licensing prevented you or someone you know from doing a job that they were otherwise perfectly capable of doing? 45% of welfare recipients said either they themselves had been blocked or somebody they knew, family member or so on, had been blocked from getting a job simply because they lacked a license. And then we say, oh, go get a job and take care of yourself. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And if you get that license, of course, this single mother I was talking about in Louisiana, she gets her license after all of that, goes back home, and is going to start making up bouquets in her kitchen to sell. Oh, no, she isn't. Occupational zoning. It's not zoned for a business. She has to have a storefront if she wants to be a florist, right? So I pay for the rent. You can go on and on. Child care. Now that she wants to work, she needs someone to look after her kid, except that the child care regulations and who can be a child care provider and what kind of facilities they have to have, even what kind of toys they have to have, are regulated in ways that drive up the cost that make it almost impossible for her to afford. In Washington, D.C., they just passed a law that said every child care worker in D.C. has to have a bachelor's degree. Parents don't have to have a bachelor's degree. But the big institutional daycare centers that charge a lot of money, they're happy with that new law. We can just go on and on about the barriers that get in the way of poor people taking care of themselves. These are all done for special interests that are very entrenched. We talk a lot in this country, and I agree, about privilege. Now we're talking about privilege. To keep people out of a profession, simply to keep your own wages, your own business away from any competition. And you can go back historically. You can look at this historically. The record's pretty clear that how much of this licensing and stuff was race-based and so on over history. Most of it was. Look, we asked, what should government do if it wants to fight poverty? Should the focus in fighting poverty be on eliminating the causes of poverty? Or should the focus be on giving poor people more money so they can get on their feet? And what they said, poor people, 59% of them said the focus should be on eliminating poverty. 70% of Americans overall felt that the focus should be on eliminating poverty. I would argue that the focus should be on eliminating poverty. If we really want to be compassionate, if we really care about poor people, we want to do more than make poverty a little less miserable. We want to reduce the number of people in poverty. We should want less poverty. We can always have an argument about whether or not those food stamps should be 99 or 97 billion. I want to worry about why so many people need food stamps. I want fewer people to need food stamps. I want a country in which everybody has the opportunity to rise up and be everything that their talents enable them to be. And the simple fact is the playing field isn't level today. It's not level on the basis of race or gender or class. But you know whose fault that is far too often? Fault of the government. And the answer isn't to give government more power, more authority, more control. The answer is to stop doing all the stupid things we're doing now. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it. I'll take your questions. Yeah.
I was quite surprised to see that, if I read your graph correctly there at the beginning, that welfare recipients are more confident than the general population that the government can tackle poverty. I was wondering if you had any insight as to why that might be the case.
Yeah, well, for one thing, I mean, let me go back to that slide here. If I can. Yeah, the question was, could government, even if it had unlimited spending, do more to be able to reduce poverty or to be able to eliminate poverty? And your question is, you were surprised at how the welfare recipients stacked up compared to the general population?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, they're depending on that check. I mean, you know, it's actually a big step for somebody who's depending on that check to say, hey, I think this check doesn't do a very good job. And even if you gave me a bigger check, I don't think it would do a very good job. You know, it's sort of like if you're working in a job and someone offers you a raise, you know, the chances of you're telling them, hey, I don't think, you know, giving me a raise is really going to make my life much better. You know, that's not something you're liable to do. You know, I think it's not surprising. In fact, I'm stunned that 58% of people said, even if you gave me a lot more money, it still wouldn't help. Yeah.
So, with your research, how did you know kind of different effects on poverty in kind of rural versus urban areas? Like, for example, like school choice probably won't help poverty the next, 4 schools over aren't all that great, or, housing regulations are very different, of course, between urban and rural areas. So how did you kind of look at that?
Yeah, the question is differentiating rural poverty and urban poverty. Urban poverty clearly has a number of specific problems that deal with itself in terms of the crime rates, in terms of the way the school systems work, in terms of housing costs that are very heavily targeted to urban areas. And frankly, urban poverty is higher. We did look at areas, however, for example, like Owsley, Kentucky, which is the poorest community in America. And again, a lot of these things actually are barriers in terms of retraining people. People have lost their jobs. A lot of rural areas just because jobs are going away. And by the way, let me just give a basic fact of life. The 1950s are not coming back. We do not have a time machine. You know, there was a time when you could drop out of school and go down to the factory and get a job and support your families. Those days are gone. I don't care whether, Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders or Man in the Moon says they're going to bring all those jobs back. They are not. Those jobs are gone and they're going to stay gone. And we're going to, but that does at least expose behind these communities. So the question is, how can we provide them with the skills or the opportunity to move up? And we find that things, for example, like occupational licensing, have a big impact in rural communities. I've talked to a lot of governors of largely rural states, and they say that's a huge barrier in those communities to getting the type of new jobs that are created. That in many cases we don't offer retraining programs or offer educational programs for continuing education for adults. The community colleges are often a problem. Transportation becomes a big problem in those areas because you do have to travel long distances. And so if you do things like penalize people for possessing a car when they're on welfare, that tends to have a big impact as well. And of course, with the rise of the opioid problems and so on, criminal justice is becoming a criminal reform. Before that, you had the meth problems, different type of drug than in the city, but you still have enormous drug problems there. So it is a different type of problem than you see in urban poverty, but a lot of these things do translate as well. Good question.
Yeah. So today, Wisconsin's governor made a statement that he's very proud of hiring 65 new prosecutors in Wisconsin. And looking at the last 30 years, states have hired over 10,000 additional prosecutors. At the same time, violent crime has gone down actually drastically. At this, so basically the correlation is the less crime we have, the more prosecutors we are hiring, right?
Yeah.
So every year now we are adding $8 million to Wisconsin state budget, right, to prosecute. And at the same time, we have a huge number of overlapping prosecutor, like charges. So if you're in New York, and you commit assault, there's 23 different categories, which gives prosecutors a huge amount of discretion and power. And you may spend 5 years or 15 years, depending on how the prosecutor feels, right? And so I think there is a big non-discussion going on in America, and both parties, like today, right? Everybody is screaming, that's fantastic, that's awesome, right? We keep America safe, and everybody is sort of really happy with this. But my question then would be sort of, how do we create a more rational system where we look actually at crimes and actually have a system that is more flexible, and we also really put some accountability towards these prosecutors and what they're doing.
Yeah, a couple of good questions out of that is how do we hold prosecutors accountable, and how do we deal with the changing facts about crime. The fact is, violent crime rates have been going down since the 70s. Everybody's so afraid of crime, and yet our crime rates are actually fairly low historically. And headed down. Some of that's simply a natural process. We're aging as a society, and senior citizens are less likely to go out and mug you than 18-year-olds. At least they mug you in a different way. Look, I think those are both very important questions. I will say first, in terms of holding prosecutors and police and so on more accountable, we vastly need to do that. We tend to not do that. Prosecutorial misconduct seldom gets punished. There's a few cases, some notorious cases in Louisiana and Mississippi that have been punished, but very seldom do we punish prosecutors for even the most grievous misconduct on that. And we give prosecutors enormous power. You mentioned the plea bargaining issue. We tend to think of, well, if somebody pled guilty, they must be guilty. Prosecutors, they charge you with like 5,000 years worth of offenses and say, if you go to trial, you're never getting out of jail. But if you plead guilty, we'll let you out in 2 years. And people would be crazy not to take that in many cases. So people plead guilty all the time to things they didn't do, or at least things that they would have had a reasonable defense for, but they're simply terrified of that as a general rule. I do think, however, there is hope. I do think there's bipartisan support for criminal justice reform. You have the Trump administration doing the First Step Act, which is very minor. I mean, the First Step Act did some stuff. For example, you can no longer chain women to their bed in prison while they give birth. That was one of the major reforms in the First Step Act. Another one was that women in prison were allowed to have sanitary napkins and pads, which is another major step forward. I'm sure for equal rights, we struck a blow. They did do some other things in terms of some retroactive changes to sentencing for crack cocaine versus powdered cocaine and a few other things along those lines. But it's very minor reform. But still, this was pushed through by the Trump administration. The tough on crime Trump administration championed this. This was Jared Kushner's baby. I mean, so this was a step forward. We're seeing, both Democrats and Republicans around the country making steps on this. Democratic presidential candidates, most of them want to do reforms. Kamala Harris wants to disavow her entire history and now supports criminal justice reform. By the way, I do urge people to look into her, not to get political, but to look into her history as a prosecutor. Some of the most egregious prosecutorial misconduct that I've seen out there. But we are seeing candidates from both sides on this issue. Yeah.
Do you feel that potentially college being such high in costs could prevent people from being able to get a higher education?
Yeah, good question on the question about college costs and higher education. I think that we need to look at a couple of things in terms of college costs. One is the question of whether or not college gives you sufficient bang for your buck. And what the research tend to suggest is that high prestige colleges like the Ivy League and so on actually are not worth the additional cost, the additional debt that you pick up going into that. If you look at what the additional salary people get in exchange for the additional debt they get going to the Ivy League college, it's actually not worth it. Some place like your college is actually worth much more per dollar you spend going in terms of the salary you get out if you're making that comparison. So I think that those are things we need to look at. The second is how much of college is actually going to educating students, and a great deal of college costs get eaten up by research and by publishing and by things that are hiring prestige professors that don't actually teach and so on, that actually have relatively little to do with the quality of education that they're providing. And one of my worries about increased student aid is that it basically gets swallowed up. There's a cycle basically where tuitions get raised just by whatever the increase in aid is. So they, or actually even more in some cases, so that the increase in aid doesn't actually make it possible for low-income people to go to school. If you don't qualify for the aid, you get kind of left out. So simply saying we're going to do more aid is impossible. Say we're going to abolish student debt, by the way, is kind of nonsense. You can't abolish debt, you can simply make someone else pay it. So it's simply transferring who the payer of that debt's going to be. Often people who didn't go to college will end up having to pay that debt. So there's a certain question of fairness there.
Yeah, you addressed the role of school choice or competition in improving educational outcomes for students who are low incomes or from low-income neighborhoods with worse quality of performance in public schools. Could you address the ways in which the experimental evidence either supports or doesn't necessarily support that conclusion, and also what the experience of other countries illustrates about the alternatives to our current system?
Yeah, I'd say a couple of things on that. First is that in terms of the evidence on school choice, it's mixed. It is hard to make comparisons in many cases, and a lot of it has to do with the degree to which the school choice program simply ends up replicating. It has so many regulations and rules around it that it simply ends up replicating the existing system and doesn't allow in change in entrepreneurship, which is what I want. I want schools popping up that are radically different and that people, that provides incentives for change throughout the community. The more you regulate the choice program, whatever it might be, the more you tend to simply recreate the school system you have now, except you call it private. Same thing goes with charter schools, by the way. You can look, charter schools can be very heavily, can be simply another public school by a different name. Charter schools aren't public schools, but can be just like the traditional school but by a different name, because it's required to be, in terms of you have to hire the same people, you have to use the same tenure practices, you have to use the same seniority practices, you have to teach the state curriculum, you have to, and so on. And what real innovation are you able to do? You also need to be able to close bad schools, and in some places, Detroit was particularly bad for this. Its charter schools didn't perform very well. So it had a particular problem with it was almost impossible to close a charter school that didn't perform, so they stayed in business. Some other places like Louisiana have actually been very successful in terms of their charters. School choice programs, the majority of studies, I will say, the DC Scholarship Program, among others, the one Milwaukee program, some others, have shown positive impacts. Some others haven't shown quite as much, or I think there's very few that have been negative, but some of them have been kind of zero change, and I suspect it's mostly because we're dealing with overregulation. And then you're looking at probably the best option is something called tuition tax credit program, which doesn't get involved in vouchers at all. It's simply a way you get a tax break for paying into a fund, and that fund then provides scholarships to low-income students to go to the school of their choice. And that's fairly new and limited. Arizona has it in a couple of other places. It's early yet to find too much data on outcomes there. I would suggest it's not just, the results cannot just be measured though in terms of whether test scores have gone up in a particular school or for particular students.
I think you've got to look at the impact it has on the education system at all. If regular schools, traditional schools have to change in order to compete, that's good for them. If their test scores go up and stuff like that, we have to look at that. There's even evidence to suggest that teacher salaries go up in the traditional schools, if there's charter schools or if there's public schools, because they're trying to bring in better teachers in order to compete and stuff like that. So there's even some evidence along those lines. And then finally, people choose schools for a lot of reasons. People may choose schools that are more in tune with their values. People may choose safer schools. Coming from Washington, D.C., I've always suggested that we ought to have a school choice program that lets you leave the public school if there's been more than 2 murders in it. Yeah.
Going back to the criminal justice and the incarceration rate
Yeah.
topic, I was pretty shocked. I mean, I was pretty shocked to see that the U.S. incarceration rate is so dramatically higher than.
Oh yeah.
And is that just simply due to overzealous prosecutors, or must be more than?
No. I mean, the prosecutors are bad, but in many cases they don't have a choice, or they have limited choices. It's because we make so many things illegal, and we require that people go to jail for things. We have mandatory minimum sentencing, 3 strikes laws, things of that nature. They all put people in prison that we don't. Other countries are much more into things like restitution. If you steal somebody's car and wreck it, you have to buy them a new car, versus let's put you in jail for 20 years.
Does it seem to you, though, are there specific things that are now illegal you think should be legal?
Sure. Drugs, sex work, a lot of tax issues, a lot of bootleg goods issues. I think that basically most Joe Biden got, they laughed the other day. He said that he didn't think people should be in prison for nonviolent crimes. I don't know that I'd go that far, but I think for most nonviolent crimes you shouldn't be in prison. That there's better ways to punish you for that.
Is there something about American culture, though, that's different, that we want to make these things illegal?
That's beyond me. Yeah, you bet.
In regards to making savings easier for Americans poor,
Yeah.
and you talked about how the highest marginal tax often falls on those who are welfare recipients who want to make a transfer to becoming a productive member of society. In your opinion, are there any specific policies that can be implemented either at the state or federal level to shift this burden from those individuals who want to make that jump?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things we could look at. One is, again, I think we should be moving away from what's called in-kind benefits and more to cash, which makes it easier to determine what people are getting on an individual basis and doesn't have all these conflicting rules about when you start losing benefits along the way. So we can devise a much better slope or a much better phase-out range if we're dealing with a single set of benefits. So I would consolidate programs. Get away from what's called in-kind, which means food stamps and housing vouchers and Medicaid and all this, and just give people money.
So, with that reflecting, as far as Andrew Yang, candidate said, so in that regards to your opinion, would that fall similar to his policy prescription as far as?
It would be similar, and he recognizes one of the reasons he wants to do this, and I've talked to Andrew Yang on occasion, and part of it is dealing with this phase-out problem. The problem with it is developed by his program is simply unaffordable. His program would cost about $3.5 trillion, which you may have noticed the federal government doesn't have a spare $3.5 trillion around it. Now, in fairness, that's gross, not net. He would phase out a number of other programs and so on, but not enough to pay for it. And then he has a VAT and some other things there, which I think are bad ideas in order to pay for it. But I think he's recognizing a legitimate problem, which is how do you deal with this sort of what's called the welfare trap or the welfare cliff that exists. Things like the earned income tax credit make a big difference. I think that we should be expanding the earned income tax credit. I think we need to change it. Right now, the income tax credit is much more of a child tax credit than an actual work credit. If you're a single childless male, for example, you're not eligible for the EITC. You should be. On the other hand, the more kids you have, the bigger EITC you get. You shouldn't. So, I mean, I would change it in much different. And the other thing is right now in the EITC, you have to wait until you file your taxes, and then 6 months later you get a check after that, so it's like 18 months before you get paid. It should be a wage supplement that you're getting every 2 weeks.
We have time for one more question.
One more, yours.
Okay. To bring this back to voting,
Yeah.
knowing that we're looking at candidates and we're thinking about candidates, what would you suggest, other than the things you've already presented tonight, how should we look at candidates and think about elections to improve the situations that you're making us aware of?
Yeah, with the current selection of candidates from both parties, if someone put a gun to my head and asked me how to vote, I'd choose the bullet. That said.
That's an easy out. Come
yeah,
on.
Well, yeah, I know. It is. I think the answer is to actually trust them beyond good intentions. And you hear candidates make a lot of promises. And I'll apply this to a whole bunch of things. You know, elect me and all these wonderful things are going to happen. You know, are they? We're in the right now. We're in the purple unicorn phase of the election, which is everybody's going to get their own personal unicorn, and it'll be in the corral in the morning and whatever. Except I want mine to be purple, but there are no unicorns, and there are no way. Most of what these folks are promising out there, and on both sides of this, isn't real. And I think that allowing them to get away with lying to us makes us complicit in some ways. I think we need to, when they make these promises, to say, look, that's fine. Now, what are you really going to do? What is your plan really? And are they offering things that can be done? Are they offering things that Congress has a hope in hell of passing? I mean, right now Congress couldn't pass, the mom apple pie and flag amendment wouldn't go anywhere. So how are they going to get through a $60 trillion plan for this or that? I think we need to ask them to be realistic with us and be honest with us and tell us when they can and can't do something, and that'll get us much further than grandiose promises ever will.
There was one student who raised his hand for a while, kind of, but
sure.
We'll come back to
I
you.
can take one more.
Okay. You stated that for colleges, like for Ivy League colleges, kind of like it's not almost worth it to go, but like how would you address sort of a stigma for it? Like if you looked at the Supreme Court justices for the U.S. for the past like 100 years, it's always been Harvard or Yale law, and
yeah, I mean, and that's a societal thing, but I'm talking about in terms of your finances. The Supreme Court justices actually doesn't make that much money. I mean, salary-wise. Yeah. I'm talking about if you're going to go into debt, $250,000 in debt or whatever, or $1 million in debt to go to Harvard. I mean, I don't know what it costs these days. And then you look at the salary you're going to get because you're a Harvard grad, how much more you're going to get than if you had gone into less debt to go to Ripon, and you made less money than the Harvard guy, but you don't have that debt. If you make that sort of comparison, where are you better off? Where are you getting more bang for your buck? And it's not Harvard.
Yeah.
Now, I didn't say no one go to Harvard. So for the media who's quoting me on this.
Let's thank Mr. Tanner. Also, thank you again for coming today. And just one more time, I remember I announced our next event, which we will do with the economics department, and Dr. Hauge is here. Dr. Hamami is also here, which is also wonderful. And we have Emeritus Paul Schoops here, so I don't want to ignore them. But so October 3rd at 4:30 in Bayer Editorium, what is the best immigration policy with Dr. Jennifer Hunt. All right, have a good night.